1,800 lives and displaced over 500,000 people. Since a bid for more autonomy from Anglophone regions began in about late 2016, before escalating into violence around 2017, the conflict has spawned horrifying stories of brutality, both from security forces and armed separatists in the English-speaking northwest and southwest. The United Nations reckons that 1.3 million people are in need, and yet the emergency is not met with much international attention. Well, for more on this, we're joined by Ilaria Allegozzi from Human Rights Watch. Ilaria, thanks so much for coming in to speak to us. Now, why do you think that the situation in Cameroon is escalating from its origins in 2016-2017?
Yeah, you're totally right. The situation in the Anglophone regions of Cameroon is getting out of control, is spiraling in a cycle of violence, which has claimed so many lives. And since the beginning of the year, especially, we have seen an escalation in the number of civilian deaths and attacks perpetrated by both the security forces and armed separatists. The reason behind this escalation is due to the crackdown by the government forces, which is radicalizing and creating more frustration among the communities. And I think with this pace of violence, attacks and destruction, the situation is set to get worse before it gets any better. And the crisis can turn into a full-fledged conflict if swift action is not taken immediately.
And it's often so there's a lot of concern about the civilians who are caught up in the middle of this. But bearing in mind it's a secessionist bid, it's for independence for the English-speaking regions. Why are civilians being targeted by both security forces and the separatists who assumedly come from these communities?
Exactly. Civilians have been caught in the middle between two fires and have been victims of abuses by both sides. The government targets civilians because they suspect them of collaborating with armed separatists. And the separatists target them for different reasons. For kidnapping for ransom, for example, they target students and teachers because they want to enforce a boycott on education. And since the beginning of the crisis, attacks on education have been escalating, and so many school buildings have been destroyed, vandalized and burned down. There was an episode, a case which we documented in our latest report in March, which concerned the kidnapping of up to 170 students, mostly girls and mostly minors, in Kumbo, in one city in the northwest, kidnapped by the separatists and released a few days later. An incident which didn't really make it to the headlines and was as serious as the kidnapping of Chibok girls in Nigeria. This is just one example, but also from the government side there have been violence and abuses, destruction of homes. Hundreds of homes have been burned down in security operations, abusive security operations, which have targeted civilians, especially because they were seen as collaborators of the Amba boys.
Bearing in mind the scale of the emergency in Cameroon, why do you think that there isn't more attention given to what's happening there?
I think one of the reasons why there's not enough attention and enough media coverage of what's happening in Cameroon is exactly because the government is trying to restrict the flow of information coming from the Anglophone regions, and also restricting in general freedom of expression. As you know, free speech is an indicator of how the government tolerates dissenting opinions, and is also an indicator on how the government takes human rights seriously or not. The government has tried to block journalists and also to block human rights organizations, which was our case. I was denied access to Cameroon in April this year, and since then I was unable to go back.
Now, Cameroon's not just dealing with the Anglophone crisis. There's also attacks from Boko Haram. There's also a political crisis. Where does the Anglophone crisis sit in this overall landscape of pressures on the country's security forces?
Yeah, you're right. The country is going through one of the most difficult periods of its history, facing Boko Haram in the far north, battling armed separatists in the Anglophone regions, and also dealing with 200,000 Central African refugees in the eastern border. And in addition to that, you have a political crisis ongoing, which is turning into a real crackdown on opposition. Since January, hundreds of supporters and members of the main political party have been arrested and are still behind bars.
Okay, thank you very much, Ilaria Allegozzi, coming in to speak to us there. The president of